Today we're going to talk about every single UFC champion's best performance versus their worst performance, starting with Ilia Topuria. I think Ilia Topuria's worst performance was against Bryce Mitchell. A lot of people can say that it was his debut against Youssef Zalal, but the way Zalal's been looking, I think that win has aged pretty well, and kind of the circumstances around Ilia Topuria's fight against Zalal kind of justify the performance Ilia Topuria put on. He took that fight on very short notice, and it was also his UFC debut. If we're being honest, his performance against Zalal was not that bad at all. I think he completely won that fight. People like to hold on to the fact that towards the end of the fight, he was getting slightly tired and backing up, but I think the real worst performance was against Bryce Mitchell. In that performance, yes, he did get a finish, and yes, he choked out Bryce Mitchell, but he did get taken down pretty easily by Bryce Mitchell, and he was held down for a little bit. And I think when people saw that, that really took a hit to, what people thought of Ilia Topuria's grappling. And not to mention the fact that, in that fight, he was kind of swinging wildly and missing. He did rock Bryce Mitchell on a couple of occasions, but there were times where he would just throw super hard and completely miss and get off balance. And it didn't look like the Topuria now. But I think his best performance was his win against Alexander Volkanovski. A lot of people might think it's the Charles Oliveira because of the first round dominant finish, or Max Holloway because he's never been knocked out. And yes, those are almost as impressive in my opinion, but Volkanovski is one of the greatest fighters of all time. He's higher all time than Max Holloway. He's higher all time than Charles Oliveira. He was the featherweight GOAT, and Ilia Topuria knocked him out cold in the second round. You can't really get much of a better performance than that against Volkanovski, and a lot of the excuses in that fight on Volkanovski's part, I don't really buy into. I don't think Volkanovski was that chinny coming into the fight from his knockout loss against Islam Makhachev. I think if he got hit by that same strike at any point in his career, he would be knocked out cold, and I think Topuria's fights afterwards against Charles Oliveira and Max Holloway kind of proved that. And Volkanovski won that first round, but it was very close. And considering it's one of the best strikers of all time that Topuria was facing, I don't think that takes away from his win that much. And his performance against Charles Oliveira just recently was great as well, but I think the main reason why it's not as high as Volkanovski, in my opinion, is just Charles Oliveira is not as good of a fighter as Volkanovski. And especially where Charles Oliveira is at in his career right now. This isn't a Charles Oliveira who is a reigning champion. This is a Charles Oliveira who lost to Arman Tsarukyan, who got subbed by Islam Makhachev. And the Max Holloway performance was great as well, but Max Holloway, just as Charles Oliveira is not at the same level of Volkanovski. And also, Max Holloway lasted much longer than Volkanovski, was going pretty much tit for tat with Ilia Topuria for 3 rounds. Alexander Volkanovski's next. I think his worst performance was his rematch with Max Holloway. He's probably had worse performances earlier in his UFC career, but I'm trying to keep it against high-level opponents. And out of his high-level opponents, Max Holloway in the rematch actually arguably beat Volkanovski. I think a lot of people thought that fight was maybe not a robbery, but could have or should have gone to Max Holloway. Volkanovski got dropped in that fight. And going into the rematch, a lot of people thought that Volkanovski would get an even more dominant victory than the first one, but that proved to not be true. He actually struggled a lot more and barely pulled off that win. But I think his best performance was against Islam Makhachev. It wasn't his most dominant performance, and he actually came out with a loss. At the end of that fight, a lot of people thought Volkanovski won. And Volkanovski showed basically every single aspect of his game. He showed his grappling. He showed his submission defense. He showed his takedown defense. He showed his striking. And even though he ended off that fight with a loss, I think it proved just how good Volkanovski is, because going into that fight, most people thought that Islam Makhachev would get a finish probably early in the first or second round. But Volkanovski completely proved most people wrong. Dricus du Plessis next, and I think his worst performance is Derek Brunson. I'm gonna be honest, he completely gassed out in the beginning of that fight, and he didn't have the best performance against Darren Till either, but I think the main reason I think the Derek Brunson performance was worse is because of the fact he was fighting Derek Brunson. Gassing out and almost losing against a guy like Derek Brunson just looks really bad in my opinion, and worse than, a fight against Darren Till or any other fight. But I think DDP's best performance was in his rematch against Sean Strickland. Going into that fight, a lot of people were picking Sean Strickland, or a lot of people were saying that it was going to be another close fight. To a lot of people's surprise, Dricus made that fight not even slightly close. He completely outstruck Strickland, broke his nose, and did it all without having to even take him down. He just completely outstruck Strickland and really made huge improvements from his last fight. Magomed Ankalaev is next, and I think his worst performance was against Jan Blachowicz. And a lot of people might be saying, oh, what about the Paul Craig fight? The thing about that fight is he mostly just got caught with a submission. I think his 5-round performance against against Blachowicz said a lot more about him than his loss against Paul Craig. Yeah, losing to Paul Craig's not the best, but his draw with Jan Blachowicz really exposed a lot of parts of Ankalaev's game. It exposed his striking and his kickboxing, especially with those leg kicks. And it also showed that, he's not that dangerous on the ground with his grappling. But that ties into his best performance, which is Alex Pereira. I think you can't really argue that that's his best performance. Alex Pereira was one of the top pound for pound fighters at the time. And not only did he beat him, but he outstruck him. He made a lot of adjustments from that Blachowicz fight. His leg kick defense did get better. Yes, Pereira was landing some leg kicks, but Pereira lands leg kicks against everybody. And going into the Pereira fight, based off of his fight with Blachowicz, you would think that the leg kicks would be even worse for Ankalaev, but that was not true at all. And Ankalaev actually handled one of Alex Pereira's most dangerous weapons pretty well. And not to mention, he completely outboxed Alex Pereira. Tom Aspinall's next, and finding the worst performance for Tom Aspinall was actually pretty hard to do because Tom Aspinall pretty much finishes everybody in the first round. You could say his injury loss against Curtis Blades, but considering that, it was just a freak injury. So I'm going to have to go with his fight against Andrei Arlovsky as his worst performance. And the main reason I'm doing that is he finished him in the second round and not the first round like everybody else in the UFC. That's pretty much the only thing I'm going off of because all of his other fights are pretty much the same story. Quick knockout. But what about his best performance? I think his best performance was against Sergey Pavlovich. It's either Sergey Pavlovich or Curtis Blades. But the reason I'm picking Sergey Pavlovich over Curtis Blades is the fact that Tom Aspinall got touched up by Curtis Blades a little bit. It didn't bother him at all, but he did get tagged pretty decently against Curtis Blades. He tanked it and he finished Curtis Blades pretty much right after. But when you look at the Sergey Pavlovich fight where Tom Aspinall completely just demolished him, didn't even absorb one strike to be honest, and really shocked the world with that performance. The Curtis Blades one was kind of expected. And like I said, he did get tagged slightly by Curtis Blades in the very beginning of the fight. Merab's next, and I think his worst performance was Jose Aldo. And Merab does have, losses in the UFC, but I'm trying to be fair and count fights when these fighters were in their prime. And his Jose Aldo fight, he got every single takedown stuffed by Aldo. And to be honest, that's an Aldo who's later in his career, who's cut down to 135. Yes, Jose Aldo has great takedown defense. He always has. But if you're Merab, you shouldn't get every single takedown stuffed by Jose Aldo that late in his career. And a weight class lower. But I think Merab's best performance was Umar Nurmagomedov. A lot of people might think it's the rematch against O'Malley, but that was kind of expected. Not many people were predicting O'Malley to win the fight. But with the Umar fight, Umar, if I'm not mistaken, was the favorite. But Merab pretty much proved majority of people wrong and out-cardioed Umar, took Umar down, literally styled on him. And I think that's clearly his best performance of his entire career. Finally, we have JDM, and I think JDM's worst performance was Gilbert Burns. And for this one reason, and it's he was taken down and held down by Gilbert Burns. I know he got the finish at the end of the fight, but getting held down by Gilbert Burns, especially the washed up Gilbert Burns that fought JDM, just is not a good look. It's not. But I think his best performance was his fight against Bilal Muhammad. It's funny because the fight before Bilal Muhammad was his fight against Gilbert Burns, and he looked worlds better in his Bilal Muhammad fight. He handled the takedowns very well. His takedown defense looked great. His striking looked insane. He looked like a much better fighter. I think he made a lot of improvements. He decisively beat Bilal Muhammad. Because of that performance, I'm now picking JDM to beat Islam Makhachev, which I would have never thought I would have done. But because of that performance, it's really convinced me just the level that JDM's at.